Hey class, first chapter that we're going to be covering in NURS155 Basic Medical Terminology is Chapter 1, Key Concepts of Medical Terminology. So I'm going to kind of run through some of the ways that I, in particular, break down medical terms so that they're easily understandable and how, honestly, how most people do it. But this is a really good foundation for you, this particular chapter. It's a short chapter, but foundationally it kind of sets you up for the remainder of the coursework that we're going to do. So I usually like to say that medical terminology is a language unto itself. It's its own language. It's rooted in Greek and Latin, and you'll see as we go in this chapter, you'll see how that kind of plays out a little bit, or how that's influenced in the terminology. But anytime you've ever watched a television program like Grey's Anatomy or ER or any of those shows that have a lot of healthcare or medicine in them, they throw out a lot of medical terminology in those shows, and oftentimes we scratch our heads as laymen and we go, I don't know what that means. You're going to be able to know what those terms mean from here on out. By the time you get done with this class, you'll be able to understand and break down terms, and then be able to sit and watch one of those shows with a family member and be able to define what that term is, okay? So let's go ahead and begin with this. Probably the biggest thing is we want to dissect medical terms. Taking a medical term as a whole word can be a little bit difficult. Understanding that it's actually broken down into parts, and then those parts are put together to form a word. That's what the key is understanding what those parts are. And those parts are always the same. Once you learn them, they always mean the same thing every time. It's just that we intersperse parts together and build other words off of them, okay? So the first step is analyzing the words by dividing them into component parts. Now, how do we do that? Most medical terms it's always going to have a root and a suffix. Oftentimes it'll have a prefix. Sometimes it'll have multiple roots. You can have more than one root term. So we're going to kind of walk through that a little bit. So let's define these things, right? So a root is kind of the basic core of the word, okay? Roots, they can't stand by themselves. They have to accompany typically a suffix or a prefix to actually make a word. But the root is the core of the word. Usually a root is a body part, an organ, a system, something of that nature, something major, right? So those roots can begin at the beginning, the middle, or the end of a word. So it kind of depends on where it's placed and what that word actually forms. What the meaning is formed of by where that root is placed, okay? Then there's a prefix, and a prefix is a modifier to the root. It comes at the beginning, hence pre, at the beginning or at the front, okay? And as a modifier, it gives us a little extra information. Typically, it indicates things like location, the number or quantity, and time, okay? So prefix. Modifier modifies the root. Typically, it's referring to location, number, or time. The suffix comes at the end of a term, okay, or behind a root. It is also a modifier, and it typically indicates things like the condition of the patient, the procedure that's being performed, or the disease or disease process that the patient may be undergoing. Okay, so those are the three parts that we're going to disassemble when we look at some words, all right? So let's take a look at one. Hematology. Okay, hematology. One root, one suffix. Okay, very common term. We hear it all the time. You've heard of a hematologist. Hematology. Ology, the study of. So anytime you see ology at the end of anything, it means the study of whatever came before it, okay? And these two words, the root and the suffix, are connected by a combining vowel, and that combining vowel is O, okay? So hematology, the study of, Hemat means blood. Okay? So when I define terms, when somebody says, hey, can you define this for me? I define it from back to front, typically. Okay? Because trying to define this one from front to back, blood, comma, the study of, that's not how we talk, right? So I usually start from the back, the study of blood. So if I say hematology and somebody says, what does that mean? Hematology means the study of blood. Okay? A hematologist, let's just throw that one in there because I said it. A hematologist is someone who studies blood. A doctor who studies blood or a scientist who studies blood. Okay? So if you see ology at the end of anything, that means the study of whatever the root is before it. And gist, G-I-S-T, that's the person who studies whatever that root is that comes before it. Okay? So hopefully you can kind of see what I'm doing here is just breaking down the parts and then putting them back together, okay, to be able to define what this means. Electrocardiogram. This is a good example of having two roots, okay? Two roots with two combining vowels. Combining vowel O to pull this whole word together. Electrocardiogram, okay? So electro or electra, E-L-E-C-T-R, means electricity or electrical activity. Cardi refers to the heart. And gram is a record. Okay? So a graph is a visual tracing. Okay? A gram is the record that was produced from that. Graphy is the process of recording or creating the record. Okay? So an electrocardiogram, if we define it and break it down from back to front, as I said before, and what this is a record of electrical activity of the heart. Okay? Hypogastric, another good one, because it actually has all three component pieces, right? It's got a prefix, a root, and a suffix. So the root is gast, or gastr, G-A-S-T-R, and that refers to the stomach. Okay? The IC means pertaining to. It's kind of a, I like to call it kind of a generic suffix that just says it's pertaining to the stomach. Okay? And then hypo is below, and hypo can also be decreased depending on what the context is when we're talking about it. Like if we talk about hypotension, that's decreased blood pressure, okay? Or low blood pressure, okay? Lower than normal. Hypogastric, break this down. It's pertaining to an area below the stomach, or pertaining to below the stomach, okay? So how would we maybe use that? A doctor may dictate a note that says, patient presents today with 2-day history of hypogastric pain. So the doctor is indicating that the pain is below their stomach. Okay? Hopefully this is helping. How do we form plurals? Here's that kind of Greek and Latin thing, right? Plurals in medical terminology can sound a little confusing, but understanding, especially how they're pronounced, is important, okay? So if you look at the examples, macula. The plural of macula being single, is maculae, with the E-A at the end. Or the A-E, sorry. The A-E. Okay, so we take macula and we add an E, and it becomes maculae, and that refers to multiples, okay? Adenoma, as a singular, the plural is adenomata. Okay, so we added the TA at the end. Adenomata means more than one. Glomerulus, add an I, and that's glomeruli, and that's referring to multiples. And then pelvis and pelvis meaning multiples. Okay. Pronunciation tips. Most of you guys know if you have a P, in particular, medical terms that begin PS or PN, the P is silent. So as in psychology or pneumonia, the P is silent. Most of you probably already know that and know how to pronounce that, but you'll see other medical terms out there that begin PS or PN. The P is silent. Okay. Oftentimes G's sound like J's, like as in gene, Gene. It's got a J sound. PH sounds like F, as in phlegm. Okay. Let's see. I at the end of the word is pronounced I. Usually the word is plural. We already kind of covered, so kind of backtracking that. Glomeruli, pronounced with an I. That denotes multiples. Okay. Eponyms. I love eponyms. Eponyms are medical terms that are derived from a person's name. Typically, it's the person who discovered the disease, created or discovered a procedure, discovered, like we have instruments that are named after scientists and doctors who created instruments for surgical procedures. So those are called eponyms when they're named after somebody, okay? The example in your PowerPoint is the Heimlich maneuver, okay? The gentleman that created the maneuver for helping people that are choking, that is now called the Heimlich maneuver because that particular scientist developed that. Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a form of dementia, and the doctor that did a lot of groundbreaking research in Alzheimer's was Dr. Alzheimer's. I can't remember his first name. It wasn't Aloysius, but it was something close to that. German physician. So, hence his research and discovering a different type of dementia, that type of dementia was named after him. So hence Alzheimer's disease. Okay. So again, kind of backtracking. Remember, medical terms are broken down, or we break them down into their component parts to understand what they are. Okay. So root first. That's the first thing I would do, is always identify the root. Okay. And again, remember that things don't change. So if we go back and think about hemat, hemat means blood all the time. It's always blood. Okay. So anytime you see that, it's going to be blood. Then we want to pick out the prefix and the suffix to determine what are we doing with the blood? What are we talking about blood for, right? Hematology, the study of blood. Okay. So break it down into component parts. Identify the root first, is my advice. And then look, and if there's multiple roots, identify multiple roots. And then the prefix and the suffix. And to define it, typically you go from the back to the front. The suffix to the front, and then work your way back over. And that's the best way to define medical terms. So hopefully you got something out of this chapter 1, a decent foundation for understanding and breaking down medical terms. Read your text, and I look forward to seeing you for chapter 2.